Let me help you understand the motion of the lead wrist throughout the swing in the flexion and extension plane of motion. You may think there is an infinite number of ways that the wrist could move, but actually there's a very clear pattern among good ball strikers as to how this lead wrist moves. I'm going to share that with you right now. And also, if you're an owner of a HackMotion Pro sensor, you're also going to get a similar video available to you on the motion of the trail wrist. That's coming later. But for today and for now, let's talk about the lead wrist. So from a start point, when you set up to the golf ball and take your standard grip, if your grip's somewhat neutral, you should see on the avatar a small amount of extension present. So the wrist should not be flat at setup. If you place your lead hand on the grip in a neutral fashion, you'll see some sort of extension. I generally see around 15 degrees. It's reading about 20 degrees there. So I generally see somewhere between 15 to 20 degrees of lead wrist extension. And then what happens in the very early part of the backswing, and we'll call the early part the takeaway, specifically position 1, P1, to position 2, P2, where the shaft's parallel to the ground. That extension basically comes out. So you see the avatar now, the extension number's reading +2. Effectively, that wrist went from having 20 degrees of extension to being flat. That's happening in that first part of the backswing. So all of that extension is coming out in the very first part of the backswing. It's useful to know if you want a checkpoint at P2, when the shaft is parallel to the ground in the backswing, just take a look at the live screen on your HackMotion app. That number's at 20 again, +20. I was going to swing back to P2. That number's almost gone to 0 there again. It's just gone past 0 actually. Just slightly extended still. But that would be a good checkpoint for you to work in that takeaway. Quite often, golfers who struggle have the extension in at setup, and then they still have the extension in at P2. You'd see there that I've increased the extension. That would be incorrect. So that's the main first checkpoint, just in the takeaway, losing that lead wrist extension, moving that lead wrist to somewhat of a more flat condition. After that, things get a lot easier actually, because from that P2 position where the wrist is more or less flat, you see that on the app there, I'm going to try and maintain that feel all the way to the top. So at the top of the swing, I go from having a lead wrist, which is somewhat flat, a couple of degrees flexed, a couple of degrees extended, but then I take that alignment and try to maintain it to the top. So I go from flat lead wrist at P2, and I've still got a flat lead wrist at the top. That would be consistent again among golfers who are able to put that club head into position, set the wrists, and then manage and maintain that throughout the rest of the backswing. Meaning, once I reach this point in my backswing, my wrists aren't twisting around in this flexion extension plane of motion. They're actually very stable, and that stable wrist condition helps to build a more stable club head. And then into the downswing, there's a slight change here in the best players. I'll show you this on the graph shortly. In the best players, we take it from that fairly flat condition, you see there -1, -2, you'd see a movement towards flexion in the early downswing. So if we said from P4, which is the top of the backswing, to P6, which is the shaft parallel to the ground in the downswing, we would have increased the amount of flexion slightly. You can see there that number's just reaching into double digits, 10 degrees of flexion. And that twist would be consistent with the motorcycle drill, which some of you may have seen. I would say that of all the patterns of wrist movements that I've studied using HackMotion over the last 5 years, I'd say that undoubtedly one of the clearest indicators of better golf, better ball striking, is a golfer whose lead wrist moves towards flexion, more flexion, in transition. Again, I'll show you that on the graph as well shortly, but that's consistent with no matter how their lead wrist actually looks at the top, the better player is twisting that wrist towards flexion as they start the downswing. That then gets us into a position here where we're just going to be able to let this club go. So now I've got the lead wrist slightly flexed. I can turn that into the ball, ideally presenting more lead wrist flexion at impact than I had at setup. If you remember from this front view, you remember I had 20, there's 18, 19 degrees of extension. I had a small amount of extension at setup, if you remember with my grip. But when I come down, I've got 11, 12 degrees of flexion, and I'm going to try and hold that into the ball. So now I've got more lead wrist flexion at impact. I've got basically a flat lead wrist than I had at setup, again, consistent with good ball strikers. You have to delay the release of that flexion extension. You have to delay the release of that extension until you've hit the ball. It's happening during the period of you hitting the ball, but you need to delay it and not allow it to come out too soon, too prematurely before you hit the ball. If you see that your impact number with your lead wrist is more extended than it was at setup, then you're a prime candidate for someone who's flipping or casting, and you really need to work on keeping that lead wrist much flatter. Once you've hit the ball and you've got that momentum of the club striking the golf ball, you should find that this lead wrist does want to and should go into quite a large amount of extension fairly quickly. That's the momentum and the force of the club being released. But it's when that happens that matters, and that's really the key thing to show you on the graph. So let's go ahead and hit one and then run through that graph just to tie all those pieces together. Quick question for you. Did you know that 80% of your golf ball's direction comes from the club face angle at impact? And it's your wrists that control that angle. If you want to hit straighter shots and add more distance to your game, then check out the link in the description below. So let's take a look at that one on the app, and we're going to pull up the graph onto the screen so that you can follow along with what I'm doing here. So at setup, the address position there, you see we had 15 degrees of extension. That was consistent with a number that I told you I often see, a little bit of extension in that lead wrist. And then what you see here as I start to scroll through the graph is very early into the swing, how that graph moves down towards the 0 line. That's the loss of that extension in the early part of the backswing, in the takeaway. So you can see that reaches a point there where it's basically 0. That's quite early on in the backswing. So that dip, that little dip down in the graph there, is the golfer going from some extension in that lead wrist to it being pretty flat at P2. I said that was consistent. Then I said from P2 to P4, so from the backswing position, the mid backswing position there, all the way to the top, that wrist condition stays quite stable. Now, you'll see that's not a complete flat line, but essentially that wrist, once it's in position, stays the same all the way to the top. So I was slightly flexed at the top there, so I ever so slightly over-flexed it. It's part of the reason I hooked that ball a little bit too much, actually. It's a tendency of mine to over-flex the wrist. I'd like to see it closer to flat. That would mean the face would have been less closed and I'd have hit a straighter shot. So you can even see there that the HackMotion app is picking up that I slightly overdid the flexion. But the context, the essence of the fact that once the club's in position here, the wrist stays pretty stable to the top. You can see the evidence of that on the graph. And then the next thing I said, which I think is critical for you to understand, is as soon as you see that top of the backswing line and the graph, as soon as you've reached that point, you should see a very strong second slope, second dip down in the downswing. So between the top and impact in this space here, this space between these two vertical lines, you're seeing that graph dip down. That's the lead wrist moving into that flexion that I talked about, something that's consistent among all good ball strikers that I've ever come across. That's a big statement. But to be able to say that good golfers do this almost exclusively, I don't see anybody making this motion who's a poor ball striker. So that's a key area there. Look to see that dip, the ski slope if you like, in the downswing. And then you'll see here, just as we're reaching impact and going through impact into the follow through, there's a very strong movement towards flexion. And I mentioned that that would be happening. This wrist is moving into flexion. It's managing exactly how much that happens and exactly when that happens. That's the critical element to being better at controlling the wrist and therefore controlling the club face. All golfers are losing the flexion. It's going towards extension at this point, but it's the time at which that happens. And again, you just see using the HackMotion app, I'm able to see that I was in 13 degrees of flexion at impact versus 15 degrees of extension at setup. That's a 28-degree difference in the amount of shaft lean I was able to present to the ball. That's going to help me make better contact, to de-loft the club, present slightly lower dynamic loft, launch the ball lower with more ball speed. So if you want to hit the ball with more consistent contact and you want to hit the ball with more distance, following the rules of this lead wrist motion will really help you. So I just wanted to make sure you're clear on that. I'd follow those key checkpoints, some extension at setup, flattened out by the time we get to P2, still flat at the top, flexing into the downswing, and then making sure there's more flex at impact than there was at address. If you can follow those rules, even walking through this slowly, just following the graph and even just watching the live avatar of your wrist as you practice before you even hit a ball, will start to give you some sort of roadmap and some direction in terms of what this wrist should be doing. I hope you found the video useful. If you are a pro HackMotion user, you can also find a link to the trail wrist data and information. And even if you're not using HackMotion at the pro level just yet, you can still watch that video to try and understand a little bit more about the role of this trail wrist, which is equally as important, if not more important, than the lead wrist.